Hi, everybody. Shalom. And we're getting ready for Passover at our house, and it's a lot of work. Getting ready, cleaning up the house, and turning everything over. Why? Because we have a couple of traditions in Judaism. One is the book of Exodus tells us as the Jewish people exited from Egypt, they didn't have enough time to let the dough rise, and therefore we have this commandment to eat matzah at the Passover Seder. In fact, the commandment is to eat it for a whole week. In addition to eating the matzah during the whole week, we have a separate commandment to avoid eating chametz. What's chametz? Chametz we translate as leavened bread, but really, if we want to make bread, what's considered bread and what's considered matzah? Well, matzah is flour and water. That's it. And what bread is, often people consider to be bread, flour and water and leavening. But really, according to the Torah definition, it's just flour and water and time. In fact, if you leave flour and water soak for enough time, it'll eventually start rising, leavening. So on one hand, we have a commandment to eat matzah. On the other hand, we have a prohibition to avoid eating chametz. The question is why? We can understand the matzah because the matzah is a commemoration, seemingly, of the Exodus. And at the Passover Seder, we want to remember what happened. But in Judaism, commandments aren't just memorials. We're not just commemorating an event that happened in the past. Really, every mitzvah is an opportunity for self-transformation. We're going to learn and we're going to grow and become better people, more spiritual people through every commandment that we do. So why the focus on avoiding the chametz, leavening, and eating the matzah only? Now, another thing that most people aren't aware of, they think, well, we just can't eat bread. That's leavened bread. But really, the Torah commands us not to have any leavening. Now, what does that mean? That means no whiskey, no beer. You say, well, what's beer and whiskey have to do with matzah? And in fact, you'll see many people baking things using certain kinds of potato flours or whatever that puffed up and they actually look like bagels. But you'd say, well, we shouldn't be eating the bagels because we're supposed to be commemorating Passover and only focusing on the matzah. Isn't that kind of cheating? But we have to be very careful in terms of understanding and interpreting things on our own and trying to understand why. The Torah has its own wisdom, and therefore the issue is the matzah and avoiding the chametz. So why does that make sense? How is that helping us by avoiding the chametz? The leavening. Well, first we have to go back to the Garden of Eden to see where this is all sourced from. In the Garden of Eden, we have Adam and Eve, and the serpent, which is called the Nachash. Remember that word Nachash. The Nachash seduces Eve into eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, convincing her that she's going to become more godlike if she transgresses God's commandment, who said, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In the end, she thought she was doing the right thing, and she ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We maybe have another seminar to discuss that whole issue, the whole Garden of Eden story. We don't have time for it now. But the Nachash, the serpent, was the one that encouraged her, created doubt, which allowed her to go against God's will. As a result of that, they were transformed and they were actually sent out of the Garden of Eden. Very interesting thing happens when they're sent out of the Garden of Eden. God gives them what? He gives them garments of leather, it says, kutnot or, garments of leather. Now it's very interesting. Why would God give them garments of leather when they left the Garden of Eden if they'd already put on aprons of fig leaves? If you're going to give them something when they're leaving the Garden of Eden, give them something they don't have. So there's a very interesting commentary that explains to us that up until that point, their bodies were made out of or with the letter aleph. Or with the letter aleph means light. So their bodies were made out of light, and their souls were even more transcendent, more ethereal. God gives them garments of ore, meaning their outer covering is now made out of ore, leather. It's the same word, just change the first letter. And ore with an ayin means skin or leather. Leather is animal skin. Now, instead of their bodies being covered with light, their bodies are covered with skin, which are more sort of block the light, blocking the spiritual light. They had chosen to ignore God, and now God made it harder for Adam and Eve to perceive godliness because their body got in the way. The rest of history that occurs after the exit from the Garden of Eden, the exile from the Garden of Eden, is an opportunity for us to repair that mistake by making the choice, choosing to eat with the proper intention, doing God's will, and avoiding the seduction of the Nachash, the serpent, which we call the Yetzer Hara. The mystics tell us that when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what had transformed their body was that the Nachash, the serpent, actually came into their body, which blocked them from perceiving God and made it much more difficult, created a world for us that's much more difficult to see God and feel spirituality. What has that got to do with Passover and the Seder? Well, the sages tell us that on one hand, the Chametz is compared to the Yetzer Hara, to the Nachash. And we want to avoid having that for this particular week out of the year. And instead, we're going to eat bread that hasn't got this Nachash in it. It hasn't got it's not fueling the Yetzer Hara. We want to weaken the Yetzer Hara. That's what we want to do on Passover. On Passover, it's the time of our freedom. And freedom means not just being liberated from Paro in Egypt, but it really means freedom means the ability to choose. In Egypt, we couldn't choose to see any other power other than Paro. Paro was the supreme being, and we suffered. We were servants to him. The lesson of the exodus from Egypt was to give us our freedom. Freedom doesn't mean liberty to do whatever you want. Freedom means now we have the ability to choose to see God in the world or see false powers in the world and identify them as false powers. So, our sages, including the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto from the 18th century, who's one of our greatest mystics, greatest sages, he says that the holiday of Passover is called Chag HaMatzot. The primary mitzvah of the day, of the week, is the matzah and avoiding the chametz. And he says there explicitly that during the rest of the year, we have this Yetzer Hara, we have this body drive in this physical world, which we need in order to motivate us to act. But our job is to get control over it. And very often, it wins the day. Our body drives overpower our spiritual drives, and we fall prey to our physical weaknesses. And what Passover is all about is to teach us that we can overcome that we can beat the serpent, as it were. So what do? He tells us that we need it during the rest of the year, but we want to be in control of it. And in order to have this Yetzer Hara that's going to allow us to act in the physical world, we need to feed it. And what's the fuel for the Yetzer Hara? The fuel for the Yetzer Hara is chametz, is leavening. Interesting. So one particular week out of the year, what we're supposed to do is deny food to our nachash, to our serpent, to the Yetzer Hara, the body drive, and nourish ourselves with matzah, which doesn't fuel it. It doesn't fuel our body drive. It doesn't fuel our Yetzer Hara, which is going to allow us to be more spiritual beings for the week. Now, I remember when I learned this and I saw it in black and white, I said, that's really fascinating. I always thought that the matzah was just symbolic, and it's a frame of mind that I'm supposed to get into. But here, the sage is telling me that the Torah is telling us that there's an actual physiological change that goes on in our body when we eat the chametz, we eat the leavened bread or the leavening, and there's a weakening of it if we avoid eating it and eat matzah instead. Well, when I see that, I want to investigate. So I went on a journey with a friend of mine, and we started checking the medical textbooks to see, can we find any medical evidence of how leavening or leavened bread could affect your body differently than if we ate unleavened bread. And I found an interesting study, a story that happened in Shiraz in Iran, of all places. And there were children who were getting malnourished. They were mineral deficient, particularly zinc deficient. And the medical doctors came to see what they could do about it. And what they did is they gave them supplements. They gave them zinc supplements, iron supplements. And when they gave them the actual supplements, it didn't really help the situation. Then they investigated the kind of food that they were eating. Now, in Shiraz, in Iran, what they did is actually what the Jewish people did traditionally, and what is common in the Middle East. Anybody who's been here to visit, and we encourage you to come and visit if you haven't been yet. They're big open ovens. And actually, if you're in the old city in Jerusalem, you can see now in the Arab quarter, they have brick ovens. And the traditional way to make bread, which is pita bread, is you roll it out in a circle, throw it up against the oven wall, and pretty soon, within a minute or two, you pull it off and you get a fresh, warm, beautiful pita. That's how they made them. And that's how they were making them in the town square in Shiraz, which was the staple food of these children. So the doctors decided to take a look at this food. What were they really eating? And they noticed that when they were making this bread, soft bread, but it was made very quickly. The flour hit the water, they rolled it all up, slapped it in the oven, and brought it out within a few minutes. From a Torah point of view, that's matzah. Because our definition of matzah is flour and water that's baked fully through within 18 minutes. It doesn't have to be flat and crusty the ways ours are, or little crackers. We do that because we want to be extra careful about it and make sure it's cooked through and through. So we make it very, very thin, and that makes it crispy like a cracker. But if you do it properly, it can be done with soft bread. And in fact, the Yemenite community has a tradition to have soft matzah. So what they said was, all right, let's take a look and let's do it the way bread used to be made in the old days. And you take flour and you take the grain and you soak it overnight, and you do that before you bake it. And that's what they encouraged the bakers to do, the town bakers to do, and that's what they fed the kids. And lo and behold, pretty quickly, the mineral deficiency left and the kids became healthy again. So the medical doctors investigated and they said, well, how did that happen? So in grain, we want to protect the grain when it's on the stalk. So what we do is, or what God does, is he creates a special coating that causes it to keep it from breaking down on the stalk. And it's called phytic acid, phytates. It's similar, if anybody there, I happen to be lactose intolerant. We don't want the milk in the mother's udder, the mother cow, for the milk to self-digest. So there's lactose put into the milk, and the lactose keeps the milk stable. It makes it undigestible. In the baby calf, in the stomach, there's lactase, an enzyme. And what happens is when the milk with the lactose comes into the stomach of the baby, the enzyme breaks down the lactose, and then the milk becomes digestible, and they can get all the nutrients. So the same thing with a sweet or a seed of a grain on a stalk. When it's growing, we don't want it to rot and break down. When it goes into the ground, we want it to break down so that it can germinate and blossom into a new grain. So the grain is protected on the stalk with phytates. Now, how do you get it to break down? You have to break it down with phytase, an enzyme. Now, God is very efficient. God is not going to sprinkle the entire world and all of the earth in the world with phytase enzyme just in case a seed falls. We know where the milk's going. It's going into the stomach of the baby calf. So therefore, God places the enzyme in the stomach of the baby calf. But God's not going to spread enzymes all over the world. So what does he do? Brilliant. The phytase, the enzyme that's going to break down the phytate that protects the grain, is built right into the same grain. The grain itself has the phytate that protects it. It has the enzyme that's going to break down, and it has the grain itself with the nutrients. So what keeps the grain from rotting on the stalk. It needs water in order to create a chemical reaction so that the enzyme can be activated and break down the phytates, which are blocking the digestion of the grain. If you just get it a little bit wet, if it's a sprinkle shower and or the rain washes off the grain on the stalk, that's okay. We want to make sure it doesn't rot on the stalk just with a simple little rain. But what happens is if you soak it for 18 minutes, then we activate the enzyme, and the enzyme break down the phytates, and lo and behold, all the nutrients can be ingested. Now, there was a very fascinating thing the doctors found out in Iran, and they saw that the phytates themselves would bond with zinc and copper and leach them out of the child's system, and therefore you become deficient. When you break down the phytates with the phytase, now the bread, the leavened bread, helps any of the zinc and copper be ingested. Not only does it not take it away, now it helps accumulate it. What does that have to do with matzah? And what does that have to do with leavened bread over Passover? Well, it has to do with the Yetzer Hara. Why? What's the Yetzer Hara? The Yetzer Hara is the serpent that's inside of our body that causes us to what? Go with our body drives. The Yetzer Hara drive is the sex drive. The Yetzer Hara drive is the anger drive. Where do we get those drives from? We get them, they're produced in our body. We understand them as hormones. Now, what's very interesting is that the hormones, the main hormone that causes what we would describe as Yetzer Hara body drives that take us away from God are related to testosterone. If you have over testosterone, it creates a lot of bad drives. Now, it's interesting, how do you make testosterone in a human being? You need a few things. You need zinc, you need copper, and you need some fat. With those three elements in your system, you can produce male hormones. So now we have to think about it. What's zinc and copper together? When you create an alloy out of it, it's called brass. We make brass out of it. And what is brass called in Hebrew? Neely, you're a Hebrew speaker. Brass is nechoshet. Traditionally, we call it copper nechoshet, but really nechoshet is a kind of is reflective in an alloy, and natural copper is very soft. When they built the brass laver, the wash basin in the temple, or the giant doors, if they were made out of copper, they would have collapsed. There's natural occurring either tin or zinc that you find along with copper. When you mine it, when you smelt it down, it'll usually create some kind of an alloy. You're not going to find pure copper. Tin and copper creates bronze, and zinc and copper creates brass, the brazen serpent. So the nachash is called nachash, and brass is called nechoshet. They're very much related. So nechoshet, zinc and copper are required to create hormones, testosterone hormone in particular. So what's happening during the week of Pesach, when we eat matzah, which is full of phytates, that the phytates bond with zinc and copper and leach it out of our system, thereby lowering our hormone levels. When we eat chametz, what that does for us is it helps ingest more and creates more hormones, which gives us more body drive. More body drive. The more body drive the body's going to overpower our spiritual side. Our goal is to have our spiritual overpower our body side. So after spending a week in Pesach, technically it should be easier for us to feel more spiritual. The challenge is after Passover. What we have to realize is when we go back to eating our chametz, we have to do it in such a way that's controlled amounts and that we have a goal to shoot for. We understand, we experienced what it was like during Passover to feel a little bit less vulnerable to our physical drives, to our nachash, to our Yetzer Hara. and that after Pesach we can spend the rest of our time working to get back to that same state while we're eating our chametz during the rest of the year. We can spend a lot of time going on to other areas of a kosher diet that have similar effects to us. And for another seminar, or if you have any questions, I'd like to encourage you to type them in and ask us or send us an email. But the reason why I wanted to share with you, you may be a little confused. I don't know, there's a lot of science there. But the reason why I wanted to share this information with you is to show you that the commandments in the Torah are not just commemorations. They're not just nice ideas, that there's a symbiotic relationship between the physical and the spiritual, and each mitzvah is there to help transform us, not only spiritually, but it affects us physically as well. And the other point I really wanted to share with you was that very often I hear people say, oh, you know, Judaism and rabbinic Judaism and the oral tradition, there's so many details, and all these details, just like, let's just have some matzah. You have to be very careful, because you can go buy matzah that's in the supermarket that isn't made in less than 18 minutes. And then really you're not eating matzah. So, yeah, but it looks like matzah, it feels like matzah, it cracks like matzah. But if it took more than 18 minutes, then you're going to have some of this fermentation going on and some of the phytates being broken down. And without even realizing it, you're eating chametz instead of eating matzah. See, but it looks like matzah. But that's not the point. We can't understand the wonders and the genius behind the Almighty's will and why the Almighty wants us to do things. The secret is in the details. And just because we see a detail and we don't understand it, we shouldn't pass it off as being meaningless, and it's not really significant, because you'll be surprised what you find underneath the mitzvahs.